Good day and welcome to my channel fam. My name is Cofford. Where are you watching from? Vanessa Holics had always believed in starting fresh. She'd left behind the small town where she grew up, with its streets full of faded memories and people who thought they knew her better than she knew herself. But here she was now, standing in the grandiose entrance of a mansion that might as well be a world apart from everything she had ever known. She took a deep breath, feeling the cool air inside the massive home. The smell of polished wood, expensive cologne, and something else. Clean. It felt sterile, not homey. She looked around, noticing the opulent chandeliers hanging from the ceiling, the sleek marble floors that seemed to shine under the soft lighting, and the walls lined with elegant artwork she would never afford. Her heart raced with nerves, but she didn't have time to second-guess her decision. This was the opportunity she'd been waiting for. A job as a personal chef for Howrod Mesh, the billionaire who had built his empire from scratch, who never smiled, never seemed to enjoy anything in life. A man who had a reputation for being impossible to please. But his wealth was undeniable. His connections endless. And she? She was just a chef trying to escape the shadows of her past. The door to the kitchen swung open, and a man with a sharp suit entered, his gaze cold and calculating. Vanessa had heard stories about him, but seeing him in person was a different experience. Howrod Mesh. Vanessa Holics, I presume, he said, his voice deep and commanding, not a trace of warmth in his tone. Vanessa straightened her back. Yes, Mr. Mesh. It's an honor to work for you. He studied her for a moment before giving a short nod. I don't like my food to be anything less than perfect, he said, his voice flat. I trust you're capable of meeting my standards. Vanessa nodded, trying to suppress the tightness in her throat. I'll do my best, Mr. Mesh. You'll find that your best won't always be enough, he added, turning to leave. Let's see if you can impress me. Vanessa stood there for a moment, the weight of his words hanging in the air. She wanted to prove herself, wanted to do well. But could she really handle this? The first few days were a blur of unfamiliar faces and unfamiliar routines. The staff were polite but distant, all walking on eggshells around Howrod, as if his moods were unpredictable. And Howrod? He was a man of few words. A man who only seemed to care about getting what he wanted, in the most precise and calculated way possible. Emotion was foreign to him. But Vanessa's job wasn't about emotions, it was about food. And if there was one thing she knew, it was how to cook. She poured herself into her work. She spent hours preparing meals, ensuring every dish met Howrod's exacting standards. She studied his preferences meticulously, learning that he liked his steaks medium rare, never rare, and his vegetables tender. Tender but with a crisp snap. Every morning, she prepared a new menu, showcasing her creativity while still adhering to his rigid expectations. But still, no words of praise came. One evening, as she plated his dinner for the night, she heard the door to the kitchen open. Howrod. He stood in the doorway, his tall, imposing figure framed by the light spilling in from the hallway. Let me taste it, he said, his voice as cold as ever. Vanessa's hands shook slightly as she placed the plate in front of him. His eyes scanned it with the scrutiny of someone who saw everything as a challenge, who could find flaws in perfection itself. He didn't say anything for a long moment. Vanessa watched him, waiting for his verdict, her heart pounding. She had become so used to the silence, but the tension in the air felt like it would snap at any moment. Finally, he picked up his fork. The silence stretched on as he took a bite. Vanessa held her breath, feeling the weight of the moment. His expression remained neutral. Not a smile. Not a frown. Just indifference. Not bad, he said, as if the words were an afterthought. It's passable. Vanessa's stomach clenched. Passable. Was that all she could ever get from him? The harsh reality settled in. She nodded stiffly. Thank you, Mr. Mesh. Later that night, after a long day of trying to please Howrod, Vanessa stood alone in the kitchen, cleaning up. The soft hum of the mansion's vast emptiness echoed around her. She didn't know why she expected anything different. After all, this was Howrod Mesh, the man who didn't believe in warmth, in kindness. His world was one of perfection, and food was just another part of it. As she scrubbed the counter, her mind wandered. She wasn't here for anything other than the job. She had made that promise to herself. She wasn't here to get emotionally attached, not to a man like him. The scars of her past were enough to remind her of the consequences of opening up. But still, something about Howrod lingered in her mind. There was something about him. She couldn't put her finger on it yet, but there was a sadness in his eyes. A pain he tried to hide behind his cold exterior. Something deeper than the perfection he demanded in his meals. The next morning, as Vanessa arrived early to prepare breakfast, she noticed something different. Howrod was already in the kitchen, standing by the large windows, his back to her. The first rays of sunlight illuminated his broad shoulders, casting a long shadow across the room. Vanessa paused, uncertain if she should approach him or continue with her task. But then he turned, his gaze meeting hers, and for the briefest moment, she saw a flicker of something in his eyes. "Good morning, Miss Hollicks," he said, his voice softer than it had been before, though still with that usual coldness. "I need something different today." Vanessa blinked, unsure of what he meant. "A dish that speaks more than just flavors," he added, his eyes narrowing slightly. "I want something that feels personal." Vanessa's mind raced. Personal? What did he mean? Was this another test, or was he actually asking for something more? Something deeper? Her fingers trembled as she reached for the ingredients, her mind swirling. She wasn't used to personal dishes. Everything she cooked had been meticulously planned to please, not to express. But as she began chopping vegetables, the rhythm of the knife against the cutting board calmed her thoughts. This meal would be different. It had to be. As she worked, she couldn't shake the feeling that Howrod was testing her in ways she wasn't prepared for. The layers of his silence, the occasional glimpses of vulnerability, what was he really hiding beneath that sharp, aloof exterior? She would find out soon enough. But she was about to uncover far more than she bargained for. The next few days passed in a blur. Vanessa focused on her work, carefully planning each meal, watching Howrod for any subtle changes in his behavior. There was something about the way he moved through the mansion, always so controlled, always so distant. But as the days went by, she began to notice the little cracks, the moments when he was less guarded, when his eyes would linger on her just a fraction longer than necessary, as though he was studying her too. This morning, Howrod had asked for something different, something personal. Vanessa wasn't entirely sure what that meant, but she wasn't about to back down from the challenge. As she prepared breakfast, her mind raced with possibilities. A dish that spoke more than just flavors. Something deeper. Something meaningful. She had been planning to make a simple omelet with fresh herbs and cheese, but the request lingered in her mind, so she decided to go a step further. She chose a traditional recipe from her childhood, something that had been passed down through her grandmother's hands, a rich, aromatic stew that carried memories of simpler, happier days. By the time Howrod entered the kitchen, the dish was simmering on the stove, filling the space with a warm, inviting aroma. It was a contrast to the coldness of the mansion, and Vanessa couldn't help but smile as the scent reminded her of home. Howrod stood in the doorway, observing her. His eyes flicked over the dish, then back to her. He said nothing. "Good morning, Mr. Mesh," Vanessa said, trying to keep her voice steady. "Morning," he replied, his voice as flat as usual. "I see you've made something different." Vanessa nodded, a small sense of pride swelling in her chest. "It's a recipe from my childhood," she said, her tone softer than she intended. "I thought it might be fitting for today." Howrod studied her for a long moment, then walked over to the stove, taking in the stew. He picked up a spoon and tasted it, his face unreadable. The second stretched into what felt like an eternity. Finally, he placed the spoon down, his gaze locked on her. "It's good," said, his words measured. "But why this?" Vanessa was taken aback. "It's something personal," she explained. "A dish that reminds me of family, of love, of home." His eyes softened ever so slightly, but the guard never completely lowered. "And do you miss it? Your family?" Her heart skipped a beat. She hadn't expected him to ask something so personal, but she nodded, her voice barely above a whisper. "I miss them every day. But, sometimes, you have to leave things behind to move forward." Howard's eyes darkened for a brief moment, his expression faltering before he quickly masked it with his usual detachment. "I see," he murmured, then turned away and began walking toward the door. "Continue. Let's see if you can keep this standard." Vanessa watched him leave, feeling a strange sense of disappointment. Why had he pulled away? Was he not moved by the dish, by her honesty? Or was there something more? Something he wasn't ready to confront? The following weeks passed much the same way. Vanessa perfected each meal with precision, trying new ideas and even experimenting with ingredients that she had once thought too extravagant for someone like Howard. She could feel herself growing more confident in her work, but at the same time, there was a growing tension between her and Howard, a tension that both intrigued and frustrated her. Howard never spoke much about his past, never offered any insight into his life outside the mansion. The man was a mystery. One evening, as Vanessa prepared dinner, she overheard a conversation from the hallway. A woman's voice. "You're still pushing people away, Howard," the voice said, sharp and demanding. "When will you let anyone close?" Vanessa froze, the knife she was holding trembling in her hand. She hadn't heard Howard speak with anyone like this before, and the word struck her with an unexpected force. Who was this woman? Before she could gather her thoughts, Howard's voice cut through the silence, cold and firm. "I don't need anyone. Not now, not ever." Vanessa's breath caught in her throat. That wasn't what she had expected to hear. The woman's voice softened, but there was an edge to it. "You're just running from the past, Howard. You can't hide from it forever." Vanessa's heart skipped a beat. The past. She wanted to know more. Who was this woman? And why did it sound like Howard was hiding from something? The door to the kitchen swung open, and Howard entered, his expression as unreadable as ever. But there was something in his eyes, something raw, something vulnerable. Had he heard her eavesdropping? Did he know? Vanessa quickly focused on the cutting board, pretending not to notice him. "Mr. Mesh," she said, her voice steady. "Dinner will be ready in a few minutes." He didn't respond at first, but she could feel his eyes on her. When he finally spoke, his tone was lower than usual. "I don't want to hear about it. Just, finish your work." Vanessa nodded, a knot tightening in her stomach. The tension between them had shifted, but she couldn't pinpoint exactly how. What was he hiding? And why did it feel like there was something much bigger at play than just food? Later that night, after dinner, Vanessa stood alone in the kitchen, cleaning the counter. Her mind was consumed with questions, with thoughts of the woman's voice, with the shadows that seemed to hang around Howard. She had learned to guard herself from becoming too attached to the people she worked for. But Howard was different. There was something about him, something beyond the aloof billionaire persona, something broken beneath the surface. And despite everything, Vanessa found herself wondering if she could help him heal. Vanessa awoke the next morning to the same feeling of uncertainty that had plagued her for the past few days. She had barely slept, her mind swirling with questions about Howard and the mysterious conversation she had overheard. She couldn't help but feel as though she was stepping into something much deeper than she had initially realized. The mansion, as always, stood quiet and imposing around her. There was an eerie stillness that felt suffocating, yet somehow comforting. The stillness mirrored the way she felt, like she was waiting for something to shift, waiting for the next move. As she prepared breakfast, she reflected on the previous night. Howard's cold words still echoed in her mind. He had been distant, guarded, but the look in his eyes, the vulnerability she saw there, had been unmistakable. There was a part of him that wanted to be reached, wanted to let someone in, but he was clearly too afraid. Vanessa was so lost in her thoughts that she barely noticed Howard entering the kitchen. "Good morning, Mr. Mesh," she said softly, turning to face him. "Morning," he replied, his usual detached tone filling the air. The tension between them was palpable, but Howard seemed intent on ignoring it, his gaze fixed on the counter as he prepared his usual coffee. I was thinking of trying something new today," Vanessa ventured, hoping to break the silence. "Something comforting. A dish my grandmother used to make. It's simple, but it means a lot to me." Howard glanced up at her, then nodded. "I'm listening." She hesitated before continuing. "It's a slow-cooked beef stew with root vegetables, flavored with herbs and a touch of cinnamon. It's the kind of meal that wraps you in warmth, something that feels like home." Howard's gaze softened ever so slightly, but he didn't speak. Instead, he sat down at the kitchen island, his presence heavy in the room. Vanessa's heart began to race, but she steadied herself, refusing to let the nerves get the best of her. As she worked, she couldn't help but notice the way Howard's eyes followed her every movement, the way he was watching her so intently, as though he was trying to figure her out. It was unsettling and comforting at the same time. What did he see when he looked at her? The stew simmered on the stove, filling the air with the rich scent of tender meat and fragrant herbs. It was a dish that took time, but that was the point. It was slow, like healing, like life itself. Nothing good came quickly. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Howard spoke again. His voice was softer now, almost contemplative. "Why do you care so much about food, Vanessa?" Vanessa paused, her hand mid-motion as she prepared the vegetables. The question caught her off guard. "It's not just about food," she said, her voice steady. "Food is about connection. It's about sharing something with someone else, something personal, something real. I've always believed that when you feed someone, you're giving them a piece of yourself." Howard was silent for a long moment, and Vanessa didn't dare look at him, afraid of what she might see in his eyes. But his voice broke the silence again. "You make it sound so simple," he said quietly. "But it's not." Vanessa's heart skipped a beat. There was a bitterness in his tone, something that she couldn't quite place. She wanted to ask more, to delve deeper into whatever it was that caused him to sound so defeated, but she stayed silent. The stew was finally ready. She ladled it into a bowl and carefully set it in front of Howard. He didn't speak for a while, his eyes fixed on the meal. Vanessa watched him closely, wondering what he was thinking. Finally, Howard picked up his spoon and took a bite. He chewed slowly, his eyes never leaving the bowl. For a brief moment, Vanessa felt a flicker of hope. Maybe this dish, with its layers of flavor and warmth, could break through to him in a way nothing else had. But as he set the spoon down, she saw the familiar guarded look return to his eyes. "It's good," he said, his voice flat. "But food doesn't fix things." Vanessa's heart sank. She had hoped, foolishly, perhaps, that this simple gesture might help him open up. But once again, Howard's walls were up. He was retreating into himself, shutting her out. "Mr. Mesh," Vanessa said softly, trying to keep her voice calm. "Is there something you're not telling me? You seem so distant. Like you're carrying something heavy. I want to understand. I want to help." Howard's eyes flicked up to hers, the moment of vulnerability flashing in his gaze before he quickly masked it. He stood up abruptly, pushing his chair back with a screech that echoed in the silent room. "I don't need help, Vanessa," he said, his voice sharp. "I don't need anyone." Vanessa's heart shattered, but she held her ground. "Everyone needs someone, Howard. Even you." He froze for a moment, his back to her. Then, without a word, he turned and walked out of the kitchen, leaving Vanessa standing there, her heart heavy with unanswered questions. Vanessa felt the weight of the silence settle around her. She wanted to chase after him, to break through his walls and uncover the pain he was hiding, but she knew better than to push him when he wasn't ready. Instead, she took a deep breath, steeling herself for whatever came next. One day, Rod, you'll have to face it. Whatever it is that's keeping you so closed off. And when you do, I'll be here. But for now, she would continue doing what she did best, cooking, healing through food, hoping that someday, through the warmth of a meal, she might be able to touch the depths of his soul. The days that followed were filled with silence. Howard's mood seemed to fluctuate between distant coldness and moments of subtle warmth, leaving Vanessa constantly trying to navigate the thin line between patience and frustration. She could feel the walls he had carefully built around himself, and despite her best efforts, he remained closed off, as if any attempt at breaking through would only push him further away. But Vanessa wasn't one to give up easily. She continued to prepare meals for him, each dish a careful balance of her childhood memories and her growing hope that someday, he would let her in. She noticed that, despite his usual aloofness, Rod was always present at every meal. He ate the food she made, sometimes with apparent indifference, sometimes with an odd, fleeting look of approval. But he never said much. It was as though he was testing the waters of trust without ever fully diving in. One evening, after a particularly busy day in the kitchen, Vanessa found herself alone in the dining room, cleaning up the remnants of another meal. Her mind wandered as she wiped down the countertops, replaying the silence that had come to define her interactions with Rod. She wondered if she was being foolish, holding on to the hope that one day he might open up. As she worked, the sound of footsteps echoed through the hall, and Vanessa's heart skipped a beat. She didn't need to look up to know who it was. Rod stood at the entrance of the room, his posture as rigid as ever, but there was something different in his eyes, a hint of something softer, something human, that she had barely glimpsed before. "I need to talk to you," he said, his voice quieter than usual. Vanessa's heart raced, but she kept her voice steady. "Of course. What's on your mind?" Rod hesitated for a moment, his gaze drifting down to the floor before he looked back at her. I didn't mean to push you away," he said, the words coming out haltingly, as if they were unfamiliar to him. "I know I've been difficult to be around." Vanessa's breath caught in her throat. She had expected him to remain distant, to keep retreating into his fortress of isolation. But this was something different. She put the cloth down and stepped toward him slowly. "Rod, it's okay. You don't have to explain. I just want you to know I'm here, whenever you're ready to talk." For a long moment, Rod didn't respond. He stood there, staring at her as if he were grappling with the words, the emotions that had long been wandered as she wiped down the countertops, replaying the silence that had come to define her interactions with Rod. She wondered if she was being foolish, holding on to the hope that one day he might open up. As she worked, the sound of footsteps echoed through the hall, and Vanessa's heart skipped a beat. She didn't need to look up to know who it was. Rod stood at the entrance of the room, his posture as rigid as ever, but there was something different in his eyes, a hint of something softer, something human, that she had barely glimpsed before. "I need to talk to you," he said, his voice quieter than usual. Vanessa's heart raced, but she kept her voice steady. "Of course. What's on your mind?" Rod hesitated for a moment, his gaze drifting down to the floor before he looked back at her. I didn't mean to push you away," he said, the words coming out haltingly, as if they were unfamiliar to him. "I know I've been difficult to be around." Vanessa's breath caught in her throat. She had expected him to remain distant, to keep retreating into his fortress of isolation. But this was something different. She put the cloth down and stepped toward him slowly. "Rod, it's okay. You don't have to explain. I just want you to know I'm here, whenever you're ready to talk." For a long moment, Howrod didn't respond. He stood there, staring at her as if he were grappling with the words, the emotions that had long been buried. His jaw tightened, and Vanessa could see the internal struggle warring within him. Finally, he spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "I've been carrying a lot of pain for a long time. I thought I could keep it buried, but it's starting to spill over." Vanessa's heart softened, her instinct telling her to step closer, to offer him the comfort he so clearly needed. But she waited, giving him the space to continue. "I've lost people, Vanessa," Howrod said, his voice cracking ever so slightly. "People who meant everything to me. And the more I tried to protect myself, the more I pushed everyone away. It felt easier to be numb, to just exist, than to feel anything." There was a rawness in his words that sent a shiver through her. She hadn't expected him to reveal so much, to let even a sliver of his pain show. Vanessa took a deep breath, then softly spoke. "I'm sorry for your losses, Howrod. I can't pretend to know what you've been through, but I do know that you don't have to go through it alone. I'm here. I'll be here, even if it's just in small ways. I just want you to heal. In your own time." Howrod's eyes flickered with something akin to disbelief. "You'd still be here after everything?" he asked, his tone quiet, almost vulnerable. "Yes," she answered without hesitation. "Healing isn't a straight path, but it's a lot easier when you don't have to walk it alone." For a moment, Howrod just stood there, staring at her, as if trying to assess whether she truly meant what she was saying. And then, for the first time since she had met him, he took a step forward. "Thank you," he murmured, his voice barely audible. "For not giving up on me." The air in the room felt different now, lighter somehow, as though a weight had been lifted from both of their shoulders. Howrod, the man who had once seemed so untouchable, now appeared more human, more fragile than Vanessa had ever imagined. But there was still so much he wasn't saying, so many things he hadn't shared. She could sense it, feel it in the way he held himself back, the way his eyes would wander away from her when things got too real. Still, Vanessa knew this was a beginning, not an end. The journey wouldn't be easy. But for the first time in a long while, she believed it might be worth it. As the evening wore on, Howrod didn't retreat to his usual solitude. Instead, he stayed in the kitchen, sitting at the counter while Vanessa finished cleaning up. The two of them spoke in small, cautious sentences, nothing too deep, but enough to bridge the distance that had existed between them for so long. For the first time, Vanessa felt like she was truly being seen, not just as the chef or the caretaker, but as a person, someone who might be able to reach him, if only he would let her in. When the last of the dishes were cleaned, Howrod stood up, stretching his back. "I should go," he said, his voice returning to its usual guarded tone. Vanessa nodded, watching him carefully. "Okay. But remember, I'm still here. Whenever you need someone." Howrod paused at the doorway, his hand resting on the frame. He looked over his shoulder at her, his gaze lingering for a moment longer than usual. "I won't forget," he said softly before turning and walking away. Vanessa stood there for a long while after he left, the silence settling around her again. But this time, it wasn't suffocating. It was filled with a quiet hope, the kind that grows when two people start to realize that maybe, just maybe, they don't have to be alone in their pain anymore. The days that followed felt like a delicate dance between them. Howrod had become quieter, but there was a subtle shift in his demeanor, a tension, almost as if he was testing the waters, unsure of how much to let Vanessa into his life. She could feel the weight of his unspoken words in the air between them, and yet, it was a relief to know that for once, he wasn't completely shutting her out. Vanessa continued with her work, as she always did, cooking and tending to the mansion with precision. But there were moments now, small moments, when she'd catch a glimpse of Howard's vulnerability, his guarded expression softening just for an instant. It was enough to keep her going, to give her hope that there was more to him than the man who wore his pain like armor. One afternoon, as Vanessa was preparing a lunch of grilled salmon with citrus and herbs, Howrod appeared in the kitchen unexpectedly. She had grown accustomed to his unpredictable visits, but this time, he seemed different, not as cold, not as withdrawn. "Smells good," he said, his voice a little warmer than usual. "I've been thinking about trying something new. Want some company for lunch?" Vanessa froze for a second, her heart skipping a beat. Was he actually offering to spend time with her? It wasn't much, but for him, it was a monumental step. "Sure," she said, her voice steady but with a hint of surprise. "I'd like that." As they sat down at the dining table together, the awkwardness that usually filled the room was noticeably absent. There was no tension, no invisible wall between them. They ate in comfortable silence, the sound of the fork and knife against the plates the only noise. But the silence wasn't uncomfortable anymore. It was a shared moment of understanding, of quiet connection. Finally, Howrod broke the silence. "I've been thinking a lot about what you said," he began, his eyes focusing on his plate. "About healing, about not being alone." Vanessa met his gaze, her heart thumping in her chest. "And what did you decide?" she asked softly. Howrod glanced up at her, his eyes lingering for a moment before he answered. "I don't know. It's hard to let go of everything. To open up to someone when you've spent so long protecting yourself. I don't know how to do that." Vanessa leaned forward slightly, her voice gentle. "It's okay to not have all the answers. Healing isn't a straight path. It's a process. And you don't have to figure it out all at once." Howard's gaze softened, and for the first time in a long time, he seemed to relax. His shoulders, which had been perpetually tense, eased. It was as though he was letting down just a small piece of the wall he'd built around himself. "I don't know if I'm ready for all of it," he confessed, his voice barely above a whisper. "But I'm willing to try." Vanessa smiled, a quiet sense of relief washing over her. It was a start. They finished their lunch, and afterward, Howrod helped her clean up, an unspoken agreement between them that he would not retreat back into his isolation immediately. They moved in tandem through the kitchen, working in a way that felt natural, comfortable, even. It wasn't much, but it was more than Vanessa had ever hoped for. Later that evening, after they had both retreated to their separate corners of the mansion, Vanessa found herself lost in thought once more. It was clear that Howrod was still holding back, still struggling with the weight of his past. But tonight, he had let her in just a little bit more than before, and that was progress. The night stretched on, and Vanessa sat in the quiet of the kitchen, staring out of the window into the darkened sky. The soft hum of the mansion's quiet stillness surrounded her. She thought of the man in the next room, a man so deeply scarred by loss, so wary of love, yet somehow, beginning to trust her. Vanessa knew that she had to be patient. This journey they were on, however slow, was not one she would rush. She had her own scars, her own fears, but for the first time, they didn't seem so heavy. Maybe, just maybe, they were starting to heal together. The next morning, after a particularly restless night filled with fragments of dreams and half-thoughts, Vanessa was preparing breakfast when Howrod entered the kitchen. He had an unusual look on his face, one she hadn't seen before, a mixture of determination and uncertainty. "I need your help," he said, his voice serious. Vanessa raised an eyebrow, surprised by the sudden request. "Of course, what's going on?" Howrod hesitated before answering. "There's something I've been meaning to do. Something I haven't been able to face, and I think I need you there with me." The vulnerability in his voice was undeniable. It wasn't the cold, calculated tone she had grown used to. This was something raw, something real. "Of course," she said, walking toward him, her heart beating in her chest. "What do you need?" Howrod took a deep breath before speaking again. "I need to go back. To the place where everything changed." Vanessa's stomach tightened with worry. "Where's that?" He looked away, almost as though he were ashamed. It's a small town in the middle of nowhere. Where I used to live, where everything fell apart. Vanessa nodded, her eyes soft. She didn't need him to explain the details. She could see the pain in his eyes. I'll go with you, she said gently. Whenever you're ready. That evening, after a long, quiet dinner, Howrod told her the details. The journey would be long, but it was clear that he needed this. And Vanessa, despite her own fear, knew she had to be there for him. This was the next step, and she would walk beside him, even if she had no idea what awaited them at the end of the road. As they prepared to leave the next day, Vanessa couldn't shake the feeling that something more than just Howard's past was waiting for them. Whatever he was going to face, she would be right there with him. And in that moment, despite all the uncertainties, Vanessa realized that sometimes healing wasn't just about the journey forward. Sometimes, it was about walking through the darkness together. The air outside was crisp, the scent of early spring lingering as Vanessa and Howrod set out for the small town he had spoken of. The journey was quiet, the miles stretching ahead of them like a silent promise that neither of them could ignore. Howrod drove with a focused intensity, his hands gripping the steering wheel with an almost mechanical precision. Vanessa sat in the passenger seat, watching him closely, sensing the weight of his thoughts. She knew this trip wasn't just about the physical distance they would cover. It was a journey into a part of Howard's past that he had long buried, and by accompanying him, she was stepping into the fragments of a life he had left behind. Her heart ached for him, but she didn't speak. She knew the time for words would come, but not just yet. She had learned enough from their time together that sometimes, silence was the only language that truly mattered. They arrived late in the afternoon, the small town almost unrecognizable to Howrod. The streets were quieter than he remembered, the once bustling market square now a shadow of what it had been. He parked in front of a modest house on the edge of town, a house that looked like it had withstood years of wear and tear, much like its owner. Vanessa followed him as he stepped out of the car, his movements stiff, reluctant. She could see the toll this place had taken on him, how the very ground beneath his feet seemed to stir up the ghosts of a life he had tried to forget. Without a word, Howrod walked toward the house, his steps slow, measured. Vanessa stayed a few paces behind, her presence a steady comfort, though she could feel his walls begin to rise again, as though he was bracing himself for something. He stopped in front of the door, his hand hovering just above the doorknob. "I haven't been here in years," he said quietly, his voice thick with emotion. Vanessa's heart tightened. She could see the battle in his eyes, the struggle between facing the past and keeping it buried. "I'm here with you," she said softly, her words a quiet reassurance. "Whatever you need, I'm right here." Howrod turned to look at her, his face a mask of unreadable emotion. "I don't know if I can do this," he admitted, his voice strained. "But I need to. I have to face it. I can't keep running." Vanessa nodded, her expression steady, even though she, too, felt the weight of what lay ahead. "We don't have to do it all at once," she said, her voice full of compassion. "Just one step at a time." With a slow breath, Howrod nodded and finally turned the doorknob. The door creaked open, revealing a dimly lit living room. Dust and cobwebs filled the air, evidence of years of neglect. Howrod stepped inside, his gaze sweeping over the familiar space. Memories seemed to flood back to him, each corner of the room holding a story, a moment of joy, a whisper of loss. He hesitated, his hand gripping the doorframe as though the house itself had the power to pull him back in time. Vanessa stepped inside after him, her heart heavy as she watched him struggle to reconcile the man he had become with the boy who had once lived here. "Do you want to talk about it?" she asked gently, her voice breaking the silence that had settled around them like a thick fog. Howrod shook his head, the muscles in his jaw tightening. "Not yet," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I need to see it all first. To feel it again." Vanessa didn't press him. She simply stayed close, her presence a quiet comfort, allowing him the space to confront the ghosts of his past. They moved through the house slowly, each step an act of courage. Halrod opened the door to a small room at the back of the house, a room that was once filled with the laughter of a family that had long since been lost. The air was stale, the sunlight barely penetrating through the dust-covered windows. In the center of the room sat an old wooden table, its surface scarred with years of use. On the table, there was a photo album, yellowed with age. Halrod reached for it, his hands trembling slightly as he opened it to the first page. The photographs that stared back at him were of a different time, a time when he was just a boy, when the world hadn't yet shown him its cruelty. He saw his younger self, smiling, surrounded by family. His parents, his siblings, all of them alive, all of them whole. The memories hit him like a tidal wave, threatening to drown him in the emotions he had spent years suppressing. The pain of their loss, the weight of their absence, it all came rushing back. Halrod closed his eyes, his breath catching in his throat. "I don't know how to live with this," he whispered, his voice hoarse with the effort of holding back the tears. Vanessa stood beside him, her hand resting gently on his arm. "You don't have to do it alone, Halrod," she said softly. "You don't have to carry it by yourself anymore." For a long moment, there was silence. The only sound was the faint rustling of the pages in the photo album. Halrod's breath slowed as he absorbed her words, allowing them to sink in, to break down the walls he had so carefully constructed. "I don't want to keep hiding," he said finally, his voice thick with emotion. "I don't want to keep running from it. But it's hard. It's all so hard." "I know," Vanessa replied, her voice steady but full of understanding. "But you're not alone in this. I'm not going anywhere." Halrod looked at her then, truly looked at her, and for the first time, he saw the strength in her eyes, the unwavering support that had never faltered. It was a look of unconditional care, a look that told him he didn't have to fight this battle alone. Slowly, he nodded, his chest tight with emotion. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice breaking. Vanessa squeezed his arm gently. "We'll face it together, one step at a time." The evening sun began to dip low on the horizon, casting long shadows across the room. The house felt less like a prison now and more like a place where healing could begin. Halrod didn't know if he was ready to leave the past behind, but with Vanessa by his side, he felt like it was at least possible. As they stood there, the silence between them was no longer heavy. It was the kind of quiet that spoke of understanding, of shared pain and hope. Halrod took a deep breath and closed the photo album, placing it back on the table. "Let's go," he said, his voice stronger now. "There's more to see, more to face." Vanessa nodded, a gentle smile tugging at her lips. "One step at a time," she repeated. The morning came too quickly for Vanessa. She woke to the sound of birds chirping outside the small window in the guest room where she had spent the night. The house felt emptier this morning, as if the walls themselves had absorbed the grief and tension that had been left behind. Vanessa knew the weight of what lay ahead. She could feel Howard's quiet resolve to confront his past, but she also knew he wasn't ready to fully open up. The distance between them was closing, but there were still gaps that he wasn't ready to bridge. She could sense it in the way he avoided certain conversations, the way he flinched at small triggers, the memories that he kept buried deep. She pulled herself from bed, quietly dressing in the pale light of the morning. She took one last look at her phone, finding only messages from her family back home, all expressing concern over her sudden disappearance. She sent a quick message back to let them know she was fine, but there was no time for conversation today. Halrod needed her more than ever. Halrod was in the kitchen when she arrived, a quiet, brooding figure as he stood at the stove, a cup of coffee in his hands. He was staring out the window, his expression distant, lost in thought. Vanessa hesitated at the doorframe, unsure if she should interrupt his solitude. "Morning," she finally said softly, walking into the kitchen. He turned to look at her, a faint, almost imperceptible smile tugging at his lips. "Morning," he replied, his voice low and measured, though there was something about it, a softness, that told Vanessa he wasn't quite himself yet. She stepped closer, offering him a small smile in return. "Any plans for today?" she asked, trying to keep the conversation light. He glanced away for a moment, a shadow flickering in his eyes before he spoke. I want to go to the cemetery, he said quietly. There's someone I need to visit. Vanessa's heart tightened in her chest. The cemetery, that was where his parents had been laid to rest. The thought of him standing alone in front of their graves was enough to make her throat ache. She nodded, her voice barely a whisper. I'll go with you. Howard's eyes met hers, and for the first time since they had arrived, there was a flicker of something akin to gratitude in his gaze. Thanks, he said, his voice rough. The cemetery was located on a hill outside the town, its gates weathered by time, and the surrounding landscape was dotted with gravestones, each one a testament to lives that had come and gone. As Howard drove them up the winding road, the air grew heavier, the atmosphere thick with history and loss. Vanessa stayed close behind him as they walked through the rows of graves, the silence between them almost oppressive. She could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on her, but she gave him space. He needed this, she knew. He needed to face the part of him that he had long since buried. When they reached the gravesite, Howard paused. The gravestones of his parents stood side by side, simple but elegant, the years etched into the stone. Vanessa watched as he dropped to his knees in front of them, his body shaking slightly. His hand reached out, his fingers grazing the cool surface of the stone as if seeking contact, seeking comfort from the memories he had long denied. For a long moment, he stayed there, his head bowed, his chest rising and falling with each breath. Vanessa remained standing a few feet away, giving him the space he needed but never once letting him feel truly alone. She knew this was a pivotal moment, the turning point of their journey together. Howard finally stood, his back straight, his eyes wet but his expression hardening again. I've spent so many years trying to forget them, he admitted quietly, as if speaking only to the wind that carried the faint scent of flowers and earth. But I can't anymore. I can't keep pretending they're not gone. Vanessa stepped forward, placing a gentle hand on his arm. You don't have to forget them, Howard, she said softly. You just have to remember them, in your own way. Their love for you, that's not something you can lose. He turned to her, his eyes still clouded with pain, but there was something softer there now, something that hadn't been there before. I don't know how to move on, he whispered. I don't know how to live without them. Vanessa squeezed his arm gently, offering him a small smile. You don't have to move on, Howard. You just have to keep going, one step at a time. With me, with your memories, with everything that's still part of you. His gaze lingered on her, his face softening in a way she hadn't expected. For a moment, she thought he might say something more, something that would change the direction of everything. But then, without warning, a distant noise interrupted the fragile peace they had found. A car engine revved in the distance, a vehicle approaching from the road behind them. Howard turned sharply, his eyes narrowing. Vanessa followed his gaze, her heart skipping a beat. The car was unfamiliar, sleek, dark, and expensive-looking. It stopped near the cemetery gates, and a figure emerged from the vehicle. Vanessa couldn't help but feel a sudden rush of unease. Something about the figure felt off, as if they were intruding on something private, something that wasn't meant to be disturbed. The figure walked toward them with purpose, and as they came into full view, Vanessa felt her stomach drop. It was a woman, tall, confident, her posture rigid. She wore a sharp black suit, and her eyes, cold and calculating, were fixed firmly on Howard. Vanessa watched as Howard's expression faltered, his body stiffening as he recognized the woman. Vanessa felt the tension rise in the air, thick and suffocating. Howard Mesh, the woman said, her voice cutting through the silence like a blade. I didn't expect to find you here. Vanessa's pulse quickened as she glanced from the woman to Howard, trying to make sense of the unexpected encounter. Watch out for part 2.